The truth about the elderly black man at the funeral, ignored by many, would soon shock everyone. It was a quiet, serene cemetery, with only the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and distant traffic breaking the silence. The mourners gathered in small groups, their faces heavy with grief. Their voices were hushed, reverent, as they shared memories of the deceased, some laughter mixing with tears. The sorrow in the air was tangible, yet there was an underlying sense of camaraderie among them. But in the midst of this gathering stood one man apart, an elderly black man. His suit, worn and slightly frayed at the edges, looked out of place. He clutched a weathered hat in his hands, his posture stiff, his eyes unwaveringly fixed on the casket. He stood at a distance, not by choice, but by some unspoken design. It was as though he wasn't meant to be there, or so the whispers suggested. Occasionally, a mourner would glance at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Others, however, would deliberately avoid looking his way, as though his mere presence disrupted the sacred balance of the moment. A woman leaned toward her companion, her voice barely a whisper, but loud enough for the man to hear. "What's he doing here?" The elderly man heard her but didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his back slightly, his grip tightening around his hat. He took a hesitant step forward, but the unspoken judgment of the crowd kept him rooted in place. His gaze remained locked on the casket, his expression unreadable. There was sadness there, yes, but there was also something deeper, a quiet determination that suggested he had a purpose for being here, even if no one else understood it. No one spoke to him, no one invited him closer. He might as well have been invisible. Yet he didn't leave. He couldn't. Something, some invisible thread, bound him to this moment, to this funeral, to the man being laid to rest. This wasn't just another funeral. It was the beginning of a story no one had expected. A story woven with the fabric of prejudice and resilience. A story about a truth buried for too long, one that would shock and change everyone who witnessed it. As the service began, the elderly black man remained at the back, watching the mourners exchange soft words and shared grief. They leaned on each other, their faces etched with sorrow, but none of them reached out to him. He adjusted his worn-out suit jacket, the fabric tight and stretched from years of use. His grip on his hat tightened once more. He tried to step closer to the gathering, but subtle shifts in the crowd's body language stopped him. A slight turn of the shoulder, a sidelong glance, these small gestures spoke volumes. His presence, it seemed, was an unwelcome disruption. The preacher's voice rose, delivering words of praise for the deceased, recounting a long life filled with accomplishments and the love of a community. The elderly man's expression softened at the mention of the deceased's name. A faint smile flickered across his lips, but no one noticed. One mourner from the front row glanced back at him, brow furrowing, and leaned toward another woman, whispering something inaudible. Both women stole another look at him, their eyes narrowing before returning their attention to the preacher. The elderly man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to blend into the background. But he didn't leave. He couldn't. His eyes remained fixed on the casket, as though it held not just the body of the deceased, but the answers to the unspoken questions that had brought him here. Earlier that day, the drive to the cemetery had been uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead, and the elderly man's mind wandered through memories. But a sudden flash of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror jolted him back to the present. His hands instinctively tightened around the steering wheel as he pulled over to the side of the road. The officer approached with a swagger, his air one of authority and disdain. "License and registration," the officer barked, not bothering with a greeting. The elderly man handed over his documents with a calm, "Yes, sir." His voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. The officer studied the papers for a moment, then peered into the car, his gaze scanning it as though expecting to find something incriminating. "What's a guy like you doing out here?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "I'm on my way to a funeral," the elderly man replied simply. his hands resting on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. The officer smirked. "A funeral, huh? Fancy place for someone like you. You sure you're at the right one?" The elderly man didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead, his expression calm but resolute. The officer lingered a moment longer, his eyes sharp, searching for something, anything that might explain the man's presence. But there was nothing to find. Finally, with a slight sneer, the officer turned and walked away, leaving the elderly man to continue his journey in silence. Now, at the cemetery, that same unease lingered, but he remained. He could not leave. His presence here, though questioned and ignored, held the key to a truth that would eventually be revealed. A truth that no one expected, one that would forever change the way they saw the past, the deceased, and even themselves. The stage was set, and the elderly black man stood silently, watching, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally emerge. With a dismissive wave, the officer handed the papers back to the elderly man. "Don't cause any trouble," he muttered before turning and walking back to his cruiser. Standing at the edge of the road, those words echoed in the elderly man's mind. He considered leaving, stepping away from the quiet rejection that weighed on him, heavy as a stone pressing down on his chest. But then his gaze drifted back to the casket. No, he couldn't leave, not yet. As the service continued, his mind wandered back to the earlier encounter, the one that still lingered in his thoughts like a bitter taste in his mouth. He could feel the officer's gaze even now, cold, dismissive. The officer had looked at him, not as a man, but as a problem to be dealt with, a potential threat. The officer's parting words repeated in his mind. "Don't cause any trouble." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Trouble. The only trouble he'd ever caused was surviving long enough to face this again. The world's constant dismissal, the silent judgment that followed him time and time again. He hadn't always been invisible. There had been a time when his presence commanded respect, when his actions had meaning, life-saving meaning. But those days were distant now, buried beneath years of quiet endurance. Yet, as he stood there staring at the casket, those memories rose up, clearer than ever. He thought back to a time long ago, a foreign land filled with chaos. The heat, the smoke, the sound of gunfire all around him. He could still feel the weight of the man's limp body on his shoulders, the blood dripping from the man's wounds as he ran through an open field, exposed and vulnerable. Bullets whizzed past, tearing through the air just inches away from his head. He remembered the sharp sting of pain as a bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not if he wanted both of them to make it out alive. The preacher's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "We gather here today to honor a man who lived a long, full life," the preacher said. "A man who touched the lives of many in this community. A man who was there for his friends, his family, and his country." The elderly man's heart ached at the words. He knew the deceased better than anyone here, better than the mourners, better than the preacher himself. Yet here he was, standing alone, unacknowledged. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the heavy feeling that had settled in his chest. It wasn't just about today. It was about every moment like this, the quiet dismissal, the looks that spoke volumes saying you don't belong here. Then the preacher's tone shifted, and the elderly man lifted his head slightly. But his story, like all great stories, is incomplete without acknowledging the sacrifices of those who stood by him. The words seemed to stir something in the crowd, and a ripple of whispers passed through them. "There are moments in life," the preacher continued, "when we are shaped not just by what we do, but by the actions of others." The elderly man's breath caught in his throat as the preacher went on. "Many of you may not know this, but during his time in the service, our dear departed brother found himself in a moment of great peril. His life hung in the balance, and it was through the bravery and selflessness of another man that he returned home to his family." The preacher paused, but the elderly man could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. The story was about to unfold, a truth that no one here, not even the preacher, could have anticipated. As the preacher continued, The elderly man felt the weight of his own unspoken history pressing forward, no longer buried, but ready to be revealed. This moment, this funeral, wasn't just about the deceased. It was about the sacrifices, the struggles, and the untold stories that lay hidden beneath the surface. The elderly man's heart beat faster as he realized the truth was about to come out. He was no longer a shadow on the outskirts of this gathering. His place in the story was about to be recognized. And when that truth was finally told, it would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as the preacher's words settled in. The elderly man's hands trembled as he gripped his hat tighter. Could it be? Did the deceased truly remember? For years, he had convinced himself that his actions were long forgotten, buried beneath the weight of time and the silence of those harrowing days. Yet now, standing in this cemetery, everything was beginning to unravel. The preacher gestured toward the mourners. "And that man is here with us today," he announced. The air shifted instantly. The murmurs grew louder, heads turned, and eyes began to search. The elderly man felt every gaze upon him, heavy and piercing. The weight of their scrutiny threatened to crush him, but he stood frozen, his mind reeling. The preacher's voice rang out clear and firm. The man who carried him to safety, risking his own life so that he would live to see his family again, is standing among us. In that moment the whispers stopped. The dismissive glances, the judgment, it all vanished. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The elderly man stood still, heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what to do or say. For the first time since arriving, all eyes were on him, not with disdain, but with awe, admiration, even wonder. The shift in the crowd was palpable. It was as though the entire world had changed in an instant. The preacher nodded toward him, a soft smile on his face. "Mr. Williams, we thank you for your courage and your sacrifice. Because of you, he lived to become the man we honor today." The elderly man's lips parted, but no words came. He looked around at the faces now gazing at him with respect, some filled with admiration, others tinged with shame. The weight of their changed expressions was almost too much to bear. He could feel the years of invisibility lifting, replaced by something he hadn't experienced in a long time: acknowledgement. The silence lingered, heavy and charged. The reality of the preacher's words settled slowly into the crowd. One of the deceased's family members, a middle-aged woman, hesitated before stepping forward. Her eyes were wide with a mix of gratitude and remorse. As she approached the elderly man, her voice trembled. "Mr. Williams," she began, "I didn't know. None of us knew. I'm so sorry." Her words were hesitant but sincere, and they broke the dam holding back the emotions of those gathered. The atmosphere shifted from tension to something softer, warmer. Another mourner, an older man, spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're the reason he came home to us. You're the reason he lived to build this family, this community. We owe you everything." The elderly man finally found his voice, though it was low and unsteady. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his gaze drifting toward the casket. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. He was my brother out there, and I'd do it again if I had to." The tension in the air softened, replaced by something gentler, something healing. People began approaching him, one by one, offering their apologies, their gratitude, their tears. The woman who had first dismissed him embraced him tightly, her sobs filling the air. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "Thank you for giving us him." For the first time that day, the elderly man felt seen, truly seen. The weight of judgment, isolation, and rejection that had pressed down on him since he arrived vanished. In its place was a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. As the service concluded, the family invited him to join them at the front, standing beside the casket of the man whose life he had saved so many years ago. They asked him to share a few words, not just to remember the deceased as a father, husband, or friend, but as a soldier whose life was spared because of an act of profound bravery. The elderly man stepped forward, his hands still trembling slightly, but his voice steady and clear. "We served together in a time when division was everywhere," he began. "But out there in the chaos, none of that mattered. We weren't black or white. We were just men fighting to survive, fighting for each other." He paused, gathering himself, his gaze drifting over the faces in the crowd. "On that day, I wasn't thinking about the color of his skin. I was thinking about the promise I made to him and to every man out there, that I'd do everything I could to bring us home." His voice cracked, and he paused again, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every syllable. "We live in a world that still struggles to see past the things that divide us," he continued. "But I'm here to tell you that in the moments that matter most, those differences don't mean a thing. What matters is how we choose to show up for each other, how we choose to see each other, how we choose to treat each other." The elderly man stepped back, his words hanging in the air like a benediction. The crowd stood, many with tears in their eyes, and for the first time in a long while, the elderly man felt the weight of the world shift. The crowd that had once ignored him, dismissed him, now stood in quiet reverence. They had seen him, not as a shadow on the edges, but as a man who had sacrificed, who had fought, and who had given everything to ensure that others might live. And in that moment, that truth was enough. Eyes moved, not just stirred by the story, but by the raw truth he had spoken. As the gathering began to disperse, several mourners lingered, approaching him to offer their gratitude, to shake his hand, to ask for his forgiveness. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like part of something greater. Standing by his car, watching the family slowly make their way from the cemetery, the elderly man felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. A sense of acknowledgement, not just for his actions, but for who he was as a person. The image of the little girl hugging him lingered in his mind. Her innocence, her unfiltered appreciation, stood in stark contrast to the dismissive glances he had endured just earlier that day. He turned back, casting one final look at the casket. His mind wandered to the war, to that fateful day when he made the choice that ultimately saved the man now lying there. It hadn't been an easy decision. He could still feel the sharp pain in his legs, the burning exhaustion as he carried the wounded soldier through the hail of enemy fire. But he never regretted it. He hadn't done it for accolades or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Yet, after all these years, he wondered, how much had really changed? How often had his sacrifices been forgotten, buried beneath a world too focused on differences to see the common humanity that connects us all? Today had been a painful reminder of that, but it had also been something else. It had been a moment of reckoning, a moment of revelation, and ultimately a moment of hope. As he climbed into his car, he noticed several mourners waving to him from the gates of the cemetery. They were different now, not just in their actions but in their expressions. There was humility in their eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the man they had once overlooked. It wasn't enough to undo the years of invisibility he had faced, but it was a start. Driving away, his thoughts were heavy yet hopeful. The road ahead seemed longer but also brighter, as though something important had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had been there. He hoped they would carry the lesson with them, share it with others, and work toward a world where no one had to prove their worth in order to be treated with dignity. The elderly man spoke softly to himself as if addressing the deceased. "Rest easy, brother. Maybe this time, they'll remember what matters." This story, he realized, wasn't just about one man. It was about all of us. It was about our biases, our assumptions, and the walls we build between one another. Racism isn't just about loud acts of hatred. It's in the quiet moments, too. It's in when someone is ignored, dismissed, or deemed less than human. It's in the sideways glances, the whispered words, the silence that allows it to grow. But today something different happened. Today we saw what happens when the truth is exposed, when we are forced to confront our prejudices and recognize the humanity we've overlooked. The man they had ignored wasn't just a hero in war. He was a hero in life. And heroes like him walk among us every day, unseen, uncelebrated. It's time we start seeing them. This is a call to action, to look beyond appearances, beyond stereotypes, and beyond the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs and who doesn't. It's time to acknowledge the contributions, sacrifices, and humanity of every person, regardless of race, background, or circumstances. The world doesn't change on its own. Changes when we choose to see each other, when we choose to listen, to learn, and to act. Today, they finally saw the man who had been invisible for so long. Let's make sure we don't need another funeral to open our eyes. Let's see each other. Let's respect each other. Let's be better. Because the world is watching and the change starts with us. As the elderly man drove on, the sun was setting behind him, casting golden light over the road ahead. And for the first time in a long time he felt seen, not for what he had done but for who he was. And that, more than anything else, gave him hope for the future.